scary stories. This happened around a decade ago when I was your quintessential angsty, weird little teenager, quite moody and angry at the world. Ironically, I think that is what ultimately saved me, but the guilt doesn't leave me. I have never fully shared this with anyone before. My family lived in one of the nicer neighborhoods of my city, and unfortunately muggings weren't uncommon, though to my knowledge at the time, none had resulted in anyone's death. I wasn't really following the neighborhood news, or any news really. I could tell my mother was getting increasingly worried over the past few months, but I just didn't care enough to ask why. She kept reminding me to lock all the doors, travel in groups, not talk to strangers, yada yada yada. The same spiel most responsible parents give their kids, only I took insult at being lectured weekly about safety at 16. Our first fight about this happened when I was told I was not allowed to walk alone from the train anymore. I was taking some extracurricular lessons at the center of the city and rode the train to the end of the line where I lived, which was in no way remote. Our apartment building was about a 10-minute walk from the station, and I had been doing that distance since I was little. I could literally do it with my eyes closed. I usually walked around with my headphones on and my old and much beloved CD player in my bag, listening to something loud and grungy, feeling completely safe in my little bubble of melodious solitude. Lots of yelling and screaming, lots of "you still treat me like a child, you don't trust me, you are suffocating me, you are taking away from my freedom, you are the world's worst mother ever" drama. You get the idea. Eventually we came to a compromise. As long as there was still light out, I could walk home. Otherwise, I'd give her a call, and she would come pick me up. I was fine with that for the time. On that particular night, however, I was really, really angry. Don't ask me what about. I honestly don't remember the reason. I just remember the wrath. I wanted to scream bloody murder, and the feeling got even more exacerbated when I realized I had to call my mommy to pick me up. Nope, no way I was doing that. Didn't matter that it was raining. I wasn't a baby or made of sugar. I got out of the train, ignored the heavy rain, and marched straight home. On the outside, I must have looked like a normal 16-year-old listening to some music while hurrying home, but on the inside I was preparing to crush my enemies, see them kneeling before me, and hear the lamentation of their women. The way from the station to my home is pretty well lit, except for one turn. Back then there were unkept hedges on both sides of the corner, one in front of the abandoned lot, and no street lights at all for about 100 feet. I approached the turn completely oblivious of my surroundings, internally planning my revenge against a yet unidentified foe, when someone jumped out beside me from the bushes wielding a large kitchen knife. Most of what follows I remember in a blur. I don't remember what he looked like. It was dark, and he was wearing a hood. I remember he smelled strongly of medicinal alcohol, but I honestly don't recall him saying anything. He probably didn't have enough time to anyway, because when he jumped out of the shadows, I was so startled I dropped my Discman, and that was it. I saw red and completely lost it on the guy. All of the day's frustrations poured out of me like a dam breaking, and I unleashed a torrent of swear words at him, most of which I made up on the spot. I completely ignored the knife, shoved him back hard, kept screaming, "Are you fucking kidding me? Are you fucking kidding me right now?" over and over, and bent over to pick up my shattered CD player. I don't know what he did, and to this day I don't know why he didn't attack me when I was crouched down, but when I gathered all the pieces and stood up, he was nowhere to be seen. Holding the pieces of my broken Discman and CD, I continued my march home, muttering, "Great, just great. That's just fucking perfect. What else is going to happen today to make this day even shittier?" And occasionally turning around to yell another "fuck you, man" at the general direction of the guy. When I got home, I got straight into a fight with a furious mother for not calling her, and made sure not to mention what happened out of fear that it would give credence to her side. The gravity of it all hit me in the shower after the adrenaline had subsided, and yet I think I still cried more for a broken Discman than for realizing the danger I had put myself through and what I just survived. It all came crashing down on me 2 days later, when one of my neighbors was found stabbed in the lot behind the hedge where I was attacked. I didn't know her that well. We went to Sunday school together, but my family and hers were neighbors for years. I overheard my mother talking on the phone about the serial killer that was making his rounds around the most affluent parts of the city, and how this was the latest in a series of muggings and stabbings in the area. I'm not quite sure how to even start the story. A lot of things I've experienced really never fit the subreddit's guidelines until yesterday, when the story wormed its way into my head again. This story happened when I started a new school in the middle of the 6th grade. I'm 9th grade now. This was technically my first middle school, and for many, many reasons I transferred out. This definitely didn't help. About halfway through, I was switched into Spanish to finish out the year. I had almost always had foreign language class, so I thought it'd be a pretty easy grade to end with. There was a lot of buzz surrounding the Spanish teacher, Mr. D, and when I first saw him and how he acted, I thought I could tell why. He was a pretty eccentric guy who, if you only had his voice and weren't looking at his stern face, you'd think that he was pretty juvenile. He almost always pronounced our names wrong, and he'd had this gigantic windmill of wheels in the corner of his room. The windmill reminded me that I'd actually heard about this teacher from an older boy called Jay in my Sunday school class. Weird how things can change so much in a number of years. I remember telling him I was going to his school. My mom and I had run away in the middle of the 6th grade year, and I would start at my new school after Christmas break ended. It was nice to know I had at least a couple of people that I knew, so I asked if he could tell me about the school, or if he had any advice. Jay told me that if I ever got Mr. D to transfer out immediately. It sounded a bit dramatic, but as we got more acquainted with Mr. D, so too did he get more acquainted with us. One thing that always made us all feel uncomfortable was how he would rub chapstick on his lips fairly aggressively for like a minute, which was definitely made worse when he'd stand on one leg resting on something and his crotch leaning forward. Sure, it was pretty uncomfortable, but not the worst thing in the world, just a bit odd. Have you ever seen a woman with her boobs rested on a desk? Sometimes it's on purpose and sometimes it's an accident, especially when you are short and sitting down. Mr. D started to do this, but with his dick. He'd stand close to a desk to look at their work, but his bulge would be laying on their desk. He wasn't desk dick height either, so he stretched a little to do it. But given how strange he already seemed to be, I brushed it off as him not being able to be aware of himself. I just feel bad for the first row. Flash forward and all of his little idiosyncrasies seemed to be more prominent as the days marched on. I remember once he even answered his phone and carried the conversation on a bit before stepping out of class. I should note, he wasn't a great teacher. He wasn't even a good teacher. English obviously wasn't his first language, which was fine because he was there to teach Spanish. Unfortunately, he didn't speak Spanish either. He'd always used the school PC to pull up Spanish videos on YouTube for us and would mindlessly stare at his personal laptop. Like I said, a pretty easy class. I just feel bad for the other students who didn't already know certain things when the tests came. We walked in one day, and on my desk, the chair in front of mine, the desk in front of mine, there was a semi-straight line of off-white liquid. It was mainly on my desk and thinned out across the chair and desk in front of mine. Mr. D came over not quite fast enough as the kid behind me asked what it was. All we got was nothing, as he very quickly wiped it up off of his hand and rubbed it on his pants. He couldn't say water because it wasn't clear. It really only looked like one thing, but there wasn't any way to definitely prove it was. I tucked my hands into my sleeves and did my best not to touch the desk. About a week after that, I came into my English class. I had, at the end of the day, to hear one of the girls having a pretty loud argument with our English teacher. I walked in at the middle, but the girl, Megan, was extremely upset and asking why she shouldn't go to the principal. Megan was a bit of a hothead, sure, but she was still a really nice girl. I couldn't see her dramatizing the situation this much. I later found out what had happened from my best friend at the time, who was in Mr. D's class when it went down. Their class was ahead of us, so their test was scheduled for that day. After papers were passed out, Mr. D went back to zoning out on his laptop until Megan needed to ask a question. She had her hand up for ages and he never noticed, so she went over to where he was at and freaked out on him. He was watching porn with the sound off on the laptop he always brought with him. He gave all of his attention to. So when I came in, Megan was being reprimanded for being pretty verbal with Mr. D. Our teacher was basically telling her she shouldn't have been upset with the teacher watching porn in class and that it's his laptop, as if that nullifies anything. Looking back, it explains so much of his shifty behavior. The desk dick rests, the hardcore stares, the personal laptop all the time, and the definite cum on our desks. It wasn't the first time he'd done it, and probably wouldn't have been his last if he were not suspended for the rest of the month. Mr. D disappeared, and we had a sub finish out the rest of the year with us. I got the fuck out of that school after everything that happened there, but still kept in touch with a couple of friends. They told me that Mr. D was back for a while and that he was the gym teacher and co-soccer coach, and the next year taught English. I really want to say it surprises me he was brought back even without knowing anything about what he teaches, but it doesn't. In hindsight, that school was atrocious. I have so many memories of bad shit students and teachers alike did to me. Another teacher was only given a suspension for actively looking down girls' skirts and up girls' skirts when they bent over. It's just concerning to know Mr. D probably still works there. I have a lot of worse shit happen to me, and I'd still suppress this memory for ages. So teacher who came on my desk and definitely scared some kids for life, let's not meet again.
I grew up in a town in a relatively rural area part of England. Once upon a time, the whole area had been ancient woodland, but by the time I grew up, their urban sprawl meant that only a few small pockets of woodland remained entirely surrounded by housing estates. The quickest way to get anywhere from the street I grew up on was to take a footpath that ran from one end of the street around the back of the houses and then through maybe a quarter of a mile wide patch of woodland before you reached the heart of town. It only took a few minutes if you took the most direct path through, but my heart would be racing the whole time. I had to walk through there to get to school or to the shops when my mom sent me to go get groceries, and knowing that my older brothers would tell me that the woods were haunted by ghosts of people who had been hung at the gallows that once stood there. When I was a teenager, I became scared of the woods for a different reason. During the winter months, when it was already dark, when I walked home from school, other kids would sometimes lurk amongst the trees to scare the shit out of the smaller kids, demand what little money they had, or sometimes even their mobile phones. But I'm an adult now, so when I visited my mom in my hometown last winter, the woods no longer held any fear for me. It had snowed probably for the first time in a few years, and my mom, in typical mom fashion, immediately informed her elderly neighbor that her daughter was visiting and would happily take her dog for a walk so that she did not have to risk the icy pavements. The morning after I arrived back there, I found myself walking down the footpath in the woods with a fat, gray around the muzzle, old Labrador in tow, It doesn't often snow in the city I live in. Now I decided to take a recent purchase, a good DSLR camera, out with me to photograph the scenery, the fat old dog, and I wandered around the woods for 20 minutes or so, the dog hobbling a bit in the snow and occasionally making a half-hearted attempt to chase wood pigeons while I snapped photographs of snow-laden branches and the stark black and white landscape. It was quiet early on a Sunday morning, so nobody else was around, and there was very few other footprints in the snow. I was quite enjoying the walk, but I had started to get a bit cold and did not want to exhaust the neighbor's dog too much, so I was just about to head back when I heard something moving quickly through the woods towards us. Someone was heading rapidly down the main path. The dog and I were currently out of view of a path, but only for a few more seconds. I don't really know why it occurred to me to hide, but I did without really thinking about it. I hesitated for a moment and then, mind full of memories of being accosted by hooded teenagers and robbed of my very first brick-like phone, I stepped off of the path and hid among the bushes and trees. The lens of my camera at the time was worth about the same as a month's rent, and I guess I was worried that some opportunistic robber would see it and decide that I was an easy target. The dog hesitated for a moment as I tugged at his lead, but followed into the bushes just in time. I crouched down with a hand on his head, willing him to be still and quiet. As a person came into view of the path just a few feet away, I didn't really get a good look at them, but I saw that it was a man, tall and wearing a dark jacket and red baseball cap, and moving in a hurry. Thankfully, the dog remained quiet, and then the man was gone. When the man was well out of sight, the dog and I stepped back onto the path and decided to take a few more pictures before we left. When we were finally heading home, the near silence of the woods was broken by the loud drone of a helicopter overhead. I could not see it clearly until we were on the footpath behind the houses and out from the trees, but once there I could see that it was a police helicopter and it was circling over the woods. I returned the fat old dog to my mom's neighbor without any incident and completely forgot about the helicopter until a little later when my mom switched the radio on in her kitchen so that we could listen to some music while we ate lunch. It was a local radio station, and their top news story was that they were hunting a man who had beaten someone nearly to death on a secluded footpath earlier that morning. The path they described linked the woods that I had been walking in to the center of town. The suspect was described as tall, wearing a dark jacket and a red hat. I saw him fleeing the scene of the crime, and it was only my paranoia about my new camera that prevented me from meeting him in the middle of the woods early in the morning with nobody else around. I don't know what would have happened if I would have stayed on the path, but I'm glad I never found out. His victim on the other footpath survived, but it was a close thing.